were actually getting off on looking at the roses of underage boys.
The boys that you remember at the party, do you remember what the average age was? I know you said they aged out at 15.
Under 15.
Okay.
Because after 15, you were like sent to other people. Like at 15, they introduced, and I was 14 when they started introducing me to John DuPont. And what was strange though at the parties, okay, there was so much blood everywhere that they had one person that would walk around cleaning up the blood that was on the floor if there was too much. And then several times they had to take actual bodies out of the parties, and they would always joke around, oh, we had to throw it in a dumpster. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know what they did with the body.
And just to clarify, the bodies that they were removing, were these individuals that had died?
They looked as if they were just numb. I just remember a couple of times where they would have the young kid, they were holding the young kid and taking them out. And Alan would joke around later on, oh, they just took him out and he's fine. They threw him in a dumpster. And that's another thing that was strange, okay? And I don't have any proof, though. There were always suicides. There were always people jumping off of balconies. There were always drug overdoses. There were always boys that they claimed were getting killed by Johns from the New Flight Bar or Carol's Speakeasy or the Bijou Theater, where old Johns killed the boys. And a matter of fact, when Hulu did the documentary on Leslie Wexner, they did research, and they did find a couple of incidences where one of the guys jumped off the balcony. It was one of Alan's older boyfriends, evidently, who jumped off the balcony. And Lance Durfee, Mrs. Florsheim's hairdresser, would always say that he was murdered and that Leslie Wexner was the alibi. So, and evidently Alan was at the New Flight Bar, and Leslie Wexner was the alibi to state that Alan was with him that day. And then you have to realize, too, they controlled everything. The entire gay scene was controlled by this group of Jewish men. And what's strange is that they would give money. There was this one guy, Chuck Renslow, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He was like their main guy, the front. And they would give him unbelievable amounts of money to open up gay establishments and clubs in the city and sex shops. They were always giving him money. And at one point, it was so crazy. Alan took me to his attorney's office, and he wanted to leave me money if anything ever happened to him. He actually put me in his will, and that's what he would do to different people, and he would do that intentionally so you felt like you were close to them. So it was just unbelievable. And then, okay, the situation at the hotel was horrible when he just went to the bathroom on me. The sex parties, the mafia parties, okay, the FBI tried to convince me that they did not exist. This is during the 80s. And then later on, people were able to locate online the mafia party brochures and documents. And they actually set the party up in Chicago as a nonprofit.
How many parties do you recall attending?
Then I went to another one in Highland Park, and it was at a mansion, and it was a huge mansion. It was an estate, okay? And they had like barns, and it was a huge estate, and they had a coach house, and I'll never forget it because it was the first kosher house I've ever been to, and it was a huge mansion. And I remember them walking us through the kitchen, and then taking us right downstairs. The house had an elevator, and in the basement, there was an actual safe. The safe was set up like a jail cell, and they would lock you in the safe. And then what they would do it was a huge, huge basement. And Richard Himmel would actually design the Mafia party spaces. And it was like they would call it their playroom. And they would show, like, for instance, on the weekends, I remember going on a tour of different people's playroom. And in the city and in the suburbs. And they were proud to show their playroom off. And in this basement, they had the same setup. It was slings everywhere and bathtubs everywhere. They had enema rooms. And the parties, though, were not just young boys. Okay, they would separate them because you had guys that only liked young boys, and then you had men that liked older guys. Mm-hmm. So they tried to separate the parties, and the parties were always normally on long weekends. And they were openly using drugs. And what's crazy is that they were so out of it, and the parties lasted all weekend at times. Mm-hmm. So they were so high and so drugged out of their minds that, I mean, I remember that they always had doctors there too that were actually participating. And the doctors would have to, like, help different people out.
The doctors were the doctors. So the doctors were participating in the sexual activity.
Were participating in the sexual activity, but they were also friends of theirs. And that's another thing. This was so strange too. They were obsessed with circumcision. They would have meetings about circumcision, and they would. I'll never forget where Leslie Wexner, and I can remember this, and I was probably 14 at the time. They would have meetings, okay, all the time at their apartments. And some of the meetings were only for Jewish people. If you were not Jewish, you could not be there. I remember when, like, relatives of the Pritzkers would come to Alan's house for dinner. They did not want to have dinner with anyone that was not Jewish. And this was the governor's family, the governor of Illinois, his family members. And they were obsessed with circumcision, and they wanted to make sure that all the hospitals in the United States circumcised boys, and they were, like, so focused on the propaganda as far as that the media was putting out with, they were trying to create that, like, an image that the circumcision had to be done for health reasons. And I remember at the time, they actually were just so obsessed with that, and they were always talking about the medical association and how as long as they controlled the medical association and the hospitals, and I asked one of my teachers why they were so obsessed with that. And one of the guys had told me that it was because when Hitler actually everything that happened in Germany, they would pull down the boy's pants, and if he was not circumcised, then they knew that he was not Jewish. Mm-hmm. So they wanted everyone in America to blend in so that they could make sure that everyone looked as if they were it was hard to tell. So that was like a big deal to them. And it was just so strange, some of the things that they did.
How old were you the last time that you had any contact with any of them?
Okay, let me tell you what happened. Okay, this is what's really strange too, and I find this interesting. No one would dig into the fact that Leslie Wexner was in Chicago. Now, Richard Himmel's daughter-in-law, Roxanne Himmel, acknowledged everything. She says, I'm glad that there's someone out there that knows the truth of what was going on. I was married to John Himmel. John knows everything that was going on. He knows the truth. And she just acknowledged everything, saying that I'm glad that everyone, that you know the truth of what happened, and we know the truth of what happened. And at the time, okay, like for instance, no one would focus focus on Leslie Wexner before he met Jeffrey Epstein. Mm-hmm. No one would focus on Leslie Wexner's Chicago years. Now, Leslie Wexner also attended Roxanne's wedding in Chicago. And Leslie's mother was very close to Lillian H. Florsheim, who I worked with. And I think I sent you a check from Lillian Florsheim.
Yeah.
I worked with her, and both of them, Bella and Mrs. Florsheim and Mrs. Wexner, they were both amazing, but they were obsessed with drag queens and transsexuals. And they would actually pay for men to get sex changes. And they'd send them somewhere in Las Vegas. I don't know where it was. But, and I went to dinner at Mrs. Florsheim's house one night with Bella, and everyone there was a transsexual. And they tricked me. I was a young boy, so I really didn't know anything about it. I thought they were all women. And then after the party, they said, well, could you tell? And I'm like, could I tell what? And I was like, I couldn't believe it because I was so young. It was all new to me. Mm-hmm. But toward the end, I would say, okay, at 14, 15, after I moved, started going to John's house, I would fly to Philadelphia and he would fly to Chicago. Lance Durfee and Lance had a major falling out with Leslie and Alan. And at the time, they were going to Mexico, bringing boys back to the United States. So through San Diego, from San Diego, they would bring them to Chicago. And Alan just started a lot of problems because he was promising everyone apartments. He was promising people money. He wasn't coming through. And Lance, I was with Lance, and he called the Mexican embassy because Alan eventually moved to Mexico. He moved to Acapulco. And he had to get citizenship. For some reason, they all left Chicago at the same time. Lincoln Higgy, our antique dealer, Leslie Wexner, Alan Kramer, they all left. So whatever happened, I don't know exactly. But they all left Chicago. And then Lance and mainly Lance, because I didn't know actually what I was doing, but I was with Lance. We called the Mexican embassy in Chicago, which I'm hoping that eventually they'll pull the file and release those documents, because Lance reported them for bringing young boys into the United States from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And which was really odd because all along they wanted white boys with a certain look, but yet, and Leslie Wexner wanted white boys, but at the same time, when he came the first time, he came with someone that could have passed for maybe Mexican or native, which I looked back and I thought that was odd. But everyone else that Leslie was with was white. And it was strange because they kind of changed what they were into. It wasn't just the white boys toward the end. Then they were starting to get involved in Mexican boys. So why, I don't know. I mean...
Similar age ranges, like all under 15?
All under 15. And Alan evidently could not get...
Oh, can you hear me still?
What's that?
The phone just cut out. The phone just cut out. I just missed what you said. You said Alan couldn't get sued?
Alan could not get citizenship in Mexico because of what after what we did, as far as turning him in the early 80s, they would not allow him to become a citizen. And I remember when I was actually living in Philadelphia with John DuPont, they actually, I would talk to Lance, and Lance would say, oh, well, it worked. He's not able to get citizenship. And because Lance just had such a vendetta against Alan at that time and Leslie, that Lance was very proud that he was able to get that citizenship stopped as far as him becoming a Mexican citizen.
So early 1980s is when you were first reporting.
I would say 84, maybe 84.
84.
I'm not exactly sure of the actual date, but I am sure that the Mexican consulate in Chicago has to have documents regarding that.
Okay.
And it was all documented. And Lance was constantly calling them. And I just remember it was an older lady that he was talking to. And she knew him because evidently he had come into the Mexican consulate's office in Chicago to do his paperwork. And I'll never forget that I remember that she knew how strange he looked, and she felt that he was very peculiar.
And then when you first reported again, that was early 1980s. Let me ask you, do you have, of all the times that you did report, what documentation do you have? Do you have lists of case numbers and we can discuss some of that, offline after.
Yes. And, as far as the Mexican embassy, no. I just know that Lance and I reported it. It has to be documented, and I know that if they pulled his file, they would see that Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer were reported.
Yeah.
Okay, they have to have that information because of his going back and forth from Chicago to Acapulco nonstop. And I sent you a picture of Alan Kramer, and it was so strange because Alan Kramer is sitting at Kramer Furs in Acapulco. Did you see that picture that I sent to you? At the bottom, there's a little, I'm like, wait, he opened up a furry in Acapulco? Come on, the top there. That was very strange. So maybe he eventually had to stay there and could not come back to America. I lost touch with him. And then let me explain what happened then, okay? I kind of after that, they introduced me to John DuPont. Mm-hmm. And John fell in love with me. And he would fly to Chicago back and forth nonstop and would fly me back and forth to Philadelphia. Sometimes I flew in a private plane, and sometimes I flew in an actual commercial plane. And eventually I moved to Philadelphia, and John had backed my company, which was DuPont Model Management, and everything is documented with the feds. And what had happened is I had mentioned to Bruce Weber, who was a photographer for Leslie and for the guy from Abercrombie & Finch. Mm-hmm. I mentioned to Bruce Weber about what had taken place with Leslie. Bruce started almost threatening me, telling me to shut up and I should not be telling everyone that story. Okay? Leslie called me at my office in Philadelphia at DuPont Model Management and started threatening me and told me that he was no longer gay and that he was getting married and he was no longer gay. So he threatened me, and do you remember the year? That was it. That was 1989, and he said that he was getting married. And I had just totally forgot about everything and lost track. But I just told Bruce Weber everything because he was working with the entire group. And I told him everything, and Leslie called me at my office threatening me. And what was so crazy is that within 6 months, John insisted that I change the name of DuPont Model Management. He insisted that I even got a phone call from Pierre DuPont, the former governor, informing me that I had to change the name of DuPont Model Management, that I could no longer use the name. And Leslie, when he threatened me, within 6 months, everyone started coming after me. And what happened is, the late 80s, they did a hatchet number on me. I was on every talk show, even Geraldo. I cannot locate any of that footage. Anything. I was able to find old advertisements for DuPont Model Management, which I sent to you. I posted them online. I was able to locate old advertisements But that's when I reported everything, because the postal inspector started harassing me. Federal prosecutors started harassing me. And the one federal prosecutor, it turned out, her husband was related, or is related, to one of Leslie Wexner's business partners.
So with the harassment, how would you characterize the harassment? Like, what was your perception at the time?
Oh, there's no words to describe it, okay? At the time, there was just so much. And when I went into detail about everything that had taken place, and the attorneys were trying to silence me, telling me that I was an anti-Semite, and that I was targeting Leslie, and I was targeting everyone and trying to let them know what Leslie was doing because I was an anti-Semite. And then when they told me that the Mafia Party did not exist, I mean, I was furious at the time. And if you look back, okay, people can go to the clerk's office in Philadelphia, the federal clerk's office, and they can pull documents that were submitted with the federal cases against me, where I'm exposing them all, and I'm talking about everything that was going on. There were two big binders of evidence that were all submitted to the court. And I went into detail about everything, and I had never seen anything like it. Okay, I had a lot of offices throughout the United States, and the takedown was so organized. Everyone that came after me was Jewish. And I think that that's very odd that everyone was Jewish. And then I felt it was odd that I was being accused of being an anti-Semite because I was reporting a group of Jewish men to the United States Attorney's Office. Now, I didn't know at the time that I was actually reporting them to other Jewish government attorneys. Mm-hmm. And when I researched several of the government attorneys, they were ex-IDF officers. At the time, I never knew that. But now I was able to search them online, and they were even former IDF officers that I'm sitting there trying to report what this group of very powerful Jewish men were doing in Chicago. So I was targeted and attacked from every area you can imagine. Every news outlet, it was so organized where within 2 days they stormed into every office. All the local news media. I was even on like 2020. We were on all the talk shows. We were everywhere.
And what were they accusing you of?
They were saying that what we were doing at the time was misleading, which it was not misleading at all. We never had one complaint or problem from any of the customers. What they did is they went online to make me look bad and to make the company look bad, and then they told the public to please call the United States Attorney's Office. Please call and report DuPont Model Management. And then they took all these complaints that people had that had called in, and they convinced the individuals that they were misled. And it turned out to be this major issue over nothing. And what they indicted me for was mail fraud. They said that one of the newsletters that I had mailed out was misleading, that I printed something in a company newsletter that was misleading. And anyone out there can go to the courthouse in Philadelphia, the federal courthouse, and pull up the case and look at what they indicted me for. It was all a setup. And that was the first time I saw how corrupt the United States Department of Justice was and how corrupt the FBI was. They went to employees and threatened the employees with decades in prison if they did not testify and lie before the grand jury against me.
On mail fraud and in reaction
they said I mailed out a postcard and a newsletter that was misleading. And because they said that it was a misleading paragraph, they said it was mail fraud because I sent the postcard and newsletter out in the U.S. mail. But what was strange is before all of this happened, the United States Postal Inspector that was in charge of everything actually came to me and almost like threatened me. So that's what happened, and I mean, it was all, mainly, I look back, and it was like, I just believe that it was all because of what I did as far as reporting Leslie Wexner. Because when I reported him, they pretended like at first the information was major, and then at other meetings they started calling me an anti-Semite. They started saying that I was delusional, there was no such thing as a mafia party, and they just kept trying to make me look like as if I was the worst human on earth.
Well, that's unfortunate. I've actually been in contact with lots of victims, including some that have memories of similar abuse that you suffered with Leslie Wexner. So
yes, and now what's really strange too, and this is like, okay, Maria Farmer, okay, she had told me, she says, oh my gosh, they did the same thing. Alan Dershowitz did the same thing and used the former FBI director, Louis Freeh, to try to create dirt on the victims of Epstein. And they were trying to create dirt. And then what's really crazy, Juliet, one of the other victims, she came forward and said, recently, she tweeted about it, how Jeffrey would threaten to plant drugs in the apartments of some of the girls, the victims, regarding the Epstein case. But what's so crazy, that's the same thing Leslie Wexner said during the early 80s. So I sent Juliet a message and I said, Juliet, that's exactly what they said to me and other young boys. That they were going to plant drugs in our apartments and where we were living and at our families' homes. So it was so odd that was another coincidence where, and this is why people need to realize that Leslie Wexner was running the show. And the reason why I say that is because the black binders, okay, they had black binders of all of us boys. They had black binders of the actual, they called it the rose, where the rectum was pulled out, that where it's just covered in blood. Okay? Maria said, oh my God, and so did Virginia. She's like, it's unbelievable. That's exactly what Jeffrey had. He had books of girls, different young girls in binders. And I said, that's exactly what Leslie had and Alan Kramer had. And then, okay, with the video cameras everywhere, everything was videotaped. And then with the drugging that Juliet said, that was exactly how we were threatened. So there was so much that Jeffrey evidently must have gotten from Leslie.
Well, I know that, like I'd mentioned earlier, Sasha has had some memories of some locations of farms and of individuals, including of Wexner. And his experience was that there was several individuals, including Trump, that were more actively involved in running the ring, and that Epstein was more of a lower on the totem pole in terms of the ring functioning. And certainly there's a lot more evidence that I've reviewed and individuals that I've spoken to. I've a specific perspective I'm careful speaking about, just because lots of active cases, lots of active investigations, but what you've described is similar to what multiple victims have described, and is similar to evidence I've reviewed.
And there's one other thing I want to mention too, which was very odd. Okay, Alan. Okay, when I eventually went to Philadelphia and I lived with John, and eventually I could not take living with John because he was taking a lot of steroids and he used a lot of drugs. And whenever we would argue, I would go to his friend's house, Jay Eldridge, who was a doctor who had direct access to the Pope. And I actually posted a picture of Jay and the Pope together. And which was really odd, though, is, okay, Leslie and the Ohio State case. It's so interesting. Now, I don't have any idea if the doctor that was in charge of the Ohio State students who molested the young men and boys, I have no idea if they were friends with him. But what was so strange is how Leslie and Alan were very close to John DuPont. John DuPont was obsessed with wrestlers too, and that's one of the reasons why he was obsessed with me, because he would always say that I had amazing genetics for my age, because I always had like a six-pack, even when I was a child. And he would always compare me to a black guy's body, John would. But what's really strange is that I find it very odd that Leslie Wexner, knew the doctor at Ohio State, where they're having problems now and they're trying to get him in for questioning. But yet, he also knew John DuPont, who was in control of the doctors at colleges in Philadelphia. And John was always talking about going to the different colleges and seeing, and even grade schools, and seeing naked boys in the shower. And he was friends with all the doctors, and they were always giving him every kind of drug you can think of. I feel that alone, I never researched or looked into the case in Ohio, and I find that interesting.
Yeah, there's some overlap there, including with Jim Jordan.
And Jim Jordan.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Jim Jordan, but I've heard a lot about him as far as the Ohio State University case.
Yeah. In those years with Alan and David and Leslie, did you hear them talk about transactions, about finances at all?
Their whole life was about transactions and money. There was only two things that they were focused on. Money, 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 and sex, 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 sex. And I was never true into the transactions. I was too young. The only time that there was a transaction as far as money is where Alan took me to the attorney's office and added me to his will. Mm-hmm. And he would play head games with the will. As far as transactions, they were always, he always had bags of cash coming in and out of the apartment. And as far as transactions, no. I just know that Alan and Leslie owned a lot of real estate together in Chicago. And they owned they were fronts for a lot of the bars and a lot of the clubs in Chicago and a lot of the sex shops in Chicago. And they used other guys as fronts. Now, I don't remember, but Alan and Leslie had different names that they would call themselves at times, but I don't remember the names. It kind of like went in one ear and out the other. Mm-hmm. And they frequently used different names, but they made me, for some reason, feel special. I was not considered like a young runaway prostitute boy like the other boys. Mm-hmm. And they even let me go to State and Lake Restaurant whenever I wanted to. And they had you could put everything on like an account. So whenever I had to eat at certain restaurants, I could use their accounts. And you had employees that worked at different stores that Leslie Wexner had in Chicago that were able to use those accounts too. And I was able to use their accounts for meals. Mm-hmm. And then I have to say, okay.
Do you remember what shop specifically, besides the restaurant?
They were like restaurants in the city. There was one called State and Lake, which was on the corner of State and Lake. Mm-hmm. And then there were just different, like, steakhouses. There were different restaurants at the Water Tower place. And I do want to mention one thing. Okay, Bella Wexner, his mother, Mrs. Florsheim did warn me about Leslie. And Mrs. Florsheim stated that his mother is amazing, but Leslie is a pervert. Be careful. Mrs. Florsheim knew how Mrs. Florsheim, she probably found out like through her hairdresser, because it was like almost like a crew. And you had the top photographers at the time in Chicago, a photographer, Victor Skrymneski, he was involved. You had the interior decorator, designer, Richard Himmel, who did Leslie's stores and a lot of the mafia sex rooms. You had Bruce Grega, who was an interior designer. You had Harold Simon. And it was all Jewish men except for a couple. But even the ones that were not Jewish, they were kept toward, like, on the outskirts. Okay? And, but yet, Mrs. Florsheim did say that Leslie was a pervert, and one day, I saw something online that Mrs. Wexner was horrible, but yet, I remember at one point, we got in Mrs. Florsheim's garnet. She called it her garnet Rolls Royce. I said purple one day, but she said, it's garnet. So we got into her Rolls Royce with Mrs. Florsheim and Mrs. Wexner and the driver, because Mrs. Florsheim had a lot of help, servants. And we actually drove because Mrs. Wexner was very concerned about the well-being of her employees. And we drove to one of the old, factories for Florsheim shoes because of the way it was designed with all the light. And she wanted to see that to make sure that her employees were very comfortable. So to think that way about her employees, I thought to myself, she had to be a nice lady.
It's a specific level of attentiveness and regard that is indicative of consideration of folks, certainly. That's for sure.
Yeah, and, so there were certain things that were done. But yet, then I thought it was very strange that they were obsessed with transsexuals at the time. And I'll never forget Mrs. Florsheim and Bella explaining to me that they were pieces of artwork. I'll never forget that. And she would have dinner parties with all transsexuals. And I remember where they would actually do their makeup, and they had a big fashion show at a club in Chicago. So,
I have a question for you regarding your memory with the boys. Do you recall any Jewish boys that were getting trafficked?
No. They made that very clear. Okay, they would not go near a Jewish boy. That was something that they would not do. And I even questioned them why. And they just refused to go near a Jewish boy. It was almost like a power thing. They only wanted non-Jewish boys, and they would even, because I was Catholic, they would always make comments about how they only wanted Catholic boys. Oh, this is something else that I would like to bring up. They had an entire group of priests. And what was really odd, some of the priests would come over and look through the binders. But this is what was so strange. A lot of those same priests later on were arrested for molesting boys. Now, I was thinking in the back of my mind years later, were they setting those priests up? Because why? It was very strange that those same priests that were always coming over were the same ones that were arrested.
But Alan and Leslie were never arrested.
Alan and Leslie were never arrested. Never. They controlled everything. There was a small group of gay men that controlled everything.
Yeah. Now,
and you can even research that online, and it talks about it.
Now, if they were all Catholic and they only wanted to molest Jewish boys, would your approach be any different? I mean, that's a question that folks that try to discredit based on opinions of racism, anti-Semitism, and so on. I mean, what do you want to? What do you want to clarify? I'd like you to clarify, and I want you to clarify what you want to clarify, your perspective on the notion of anti-Semitism.
I personally am not I'm not an anti-Semite at all, but at the same time, I believe that because of what they did to me, I had an issue with, and I was never really around, I never really associated with many Jewish people, except I did have later on where cousins and married Jews, but I never had connections with many Jews until I met Alan and Leslie. So because of what I experienced with them, and then what happened to me when I went to the FBI and I was accused of being an anti-Semite because I reported them, I still always had friends that were Jewish, but I just felt that they were bad. Because I have friends that are Jewish that are absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I always have. And
you thought Leslie and Alan were bad, but
yes,
not all
I
Jews
felt
were
like
bad.
the entire, like what they called themselves, the Jew crew.
Yeah.
I felt like the Jew crew was bad. And I want to make that very clear. I just find what they were doing was bad. And then I kind of forgot about everything. And then once I connected with Maria Farmer, and she was telling me her experiences, and they were exactly what I had experienced. And when she was talking about Ghislaine and Jeffrey, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer would say. And those were the same. Like, I remember they made it very clear that the Jewish country clubs in the Chicago area, and there were Jewish country clubs and camps for kids, that they were only for Jewish kids. That was it. And they were Jewish country clubs that they went to, and no one could go there if they were not Jewish. And they wanted us to feel like there was a separation, and we were not allowed within that little group. So therefore, we felt like we were separated from the real, like, say, Alan and Leslie, because they were Jewish and we were not allowed in that group.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even when I think about when the Pritzkers or the Crowns from Chicago would meet with them and have dinner, we were not allowed around.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yet, I believe that because of what Leslie and Alan did and the way they operated, I believe that they had major issues. All Jews do not have the issues. And I also believe that I kind of forgot about it all. But yet, when I connected with Virginia and I connected with Maria, all of it started coming back into my mind, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I mean, that's exactly what happened to me.
Well,
And what they did was horrible.
Yeah. Well, and it, I mean, facts are facts and justice is justice, you know.
Exactly.
So,
but the ones that I'm so mad at, And the problem is, I realized that the entire system, the Department of Justice, is so corrupt. The FBI is so corrupt. They're not going to do anything. So I sort of just gave up. And, I mean, after coming forward during the late 90s, during the late 80s, and when I had experienced what I had experienced, I just feel like it was even corrupt back then, but we didn't have social media to expose these individuals. At least now you have social media that people can have a voice and expose corrupt federal prosecutors and expose corrupt government officials in the White House and expose corrupt FBI agents. And another thing, everyone keeps talking about the Epstein files. People need to talk about the CIA files and the State Department files. I cannot get into detail about everything, but the CIA and the State Department has a lot of information that needs to be released. And that's what people need to focus on.
Yeah, that's something that I've reviewed and assessed. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of psyops. There's a lot of false flags.
Yes.
And there's a lot of folks, good folks, decent folks, that want justice. And, let's continue these conversations. I'm going to pause recording right now.
Okay.